So today we'll be discussing cards that players constantly ask me if they can ash, or they just try to ash them anyway because it's the worst that happens. Someone tells them they can't ash it. Welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. My name is Benji, and welcome to Meta Tips for Duelists who are too lazy to read. This is where I will tell you card effects or rulings or interactions that you would have figured out for yourself if you were just willing to read the cards. If you enjoy this series, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to see more episodes like this in the future. If you have ideas for future episodes you think would help a lazy duelist like yourself or a friend, make sure to leave a comment down below, and I'll see what I can do for you in the future. But of course, make sure to check the playlist in the card up above to see if your questions have been answered in a different episode. So today we're talking about Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. If you're not familiar with Ash, which I don't know how that would be possible at this point in the game's existence, Ash Blossom is a card that can negate one of three types of effects. The effects include the effects to special summon monsters from the deck, add cards from the deck to the hand, or send cards from the deck to the graveyard. So we're going to start by talking about a couple of cards that you can ash that you might not have been completely aware that you could ash, the first of which is Shaddolls Fusion. The effect of Shaddolls Fusion allows you to fuse using material from your deck as fusion material, which means you would be sending cards from your deck to the graveyard if your opponent controls a monster summoned from the extra deck. Now, there's a chance your opponent doesn't control a monster from the extra deck, but you can still ash this card, and that is there is nothing that says by the time that this chain resolves and that Shaddolls Fusion resolves that there won't be a monster from the extra deck on the field on your opponent's side of the field. So they can still ash this card, even though the odds of that happening are low to not likely at all. I guess it's possible if they, I don't know, resolve some very weird card effects. They could get an extra deck monster on the field. Even if you were to choose to use monsters from your hand as the fusion material, you would still be able to ash this card because there is a possibility that you can choose that when this card resolves. You can even ash it under Magical Meltdown in case you thought you couldn't do that. Magical Meltdown says you can't negate the activation of a card or an effect that would fusion summon a monster. Shaddolls Fusion's effect can be negated by ash. It wouldn't be negating the activation of the effect. The card has been activated, but the effect was negated. You can't use a Ghost Bell on an invocation because it would negate the activation of the card, and Ghost Bell specifically negates activation. So Ghost Bell is a little bit weaker to Magical Meltdown. Onto another card you may not have been aware you can ash. Shaddolls Fusion, I'm sure it makes sense that you could ash it. You might not have been aware that you can ash it all the time. But you might not have been aware that you could ash all the time is Virtual World City Kowloon, which has the effect to send 3 cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard if you happen to control 3 or more Virtual World Gate cards when you activate this card, which is highly unlikely and not likely to happen by the time this card resolves. But the possibility that they could be on the field when this card resolves means that you can always ash this card. And it is a great card to ash because they often need to put a Virtual World card on the field in order to activate all their cards in their hand. So ashing this card, excellent card to ash. While we're mentioning Ghost Bell at this point anyway, I figured I might as well mention another card you can Ghost Bell, and that is Psy-Framegear Gamma, which can both be ashed and belled because it summons a Psy-Frame driver from your hand, deck, or graveyard at resolution, and there's no way of telling where that driver is going to be at that time. Even if the driver's in your hand, there is a chance that the card makes its way into the deck or the graveyard when the card resolves. Maybe you activate Magical Mallet, or Reload, or one of these cards that shuffles things back into the deck. Or you Twin Twister and discard the driver for cost. Because there's a possibility that the driver could come from your deck or your graveyard, that means you can always ash or bell Psy-Framegear Gamma. You can also always ash Nadir Servant. Nadir Servant has the effect to add a Dogmatica card from your deck or graveyard to your hand. And just because the Dogmatica card's not in your graveyard when this card is activated doesn't mean it won't be there when it resolves, meaning Nadir Servant is always valid to be ashed and Ghost Belled at all times, because there's always a chance that the card makes its way into the deck or into the graveyard before it resolves. You don't choose where you're getting it before the card resolves, which is a big difference, because a card like Triple Tactics Talents, you actually do choose which effect you are using when you activate this card. And 2 of its 3 effects aren't ashable. So if you activate Talents and you say you're taking your opponent's monster, you can't ash that, because you choose the effect on activation. It has 3 effects to choose from. You choose one. If it doesn't meet the requirements of ash, you can't use it. Just because an effect on a card can be ashed doesn't mean you can ash it. It means if there's a possibility of the card resolving with an effect that would meet the requirements of Ash, you can, such as the Nightmare monsters. I'm going to briefly go over Ash for a Nightmare Phoenix. Nightmare Phoenix, when co-linked, has the ability to draw a card. Even if you choose not to draw a card, because there's a possibility of drawing a card when it's co-linked if it was link summoned, you can Ash this card's effect to pop a back row. There's a possibility that this card could draw a card if it were co-linked when it was summoned. But if this card wasn't co-linked when it's summoned, it doesn't matter if it becomes co-linked, it doesn't suddenly become able to draw a card. So you can only Ash a Nightmare Phoenix if it was co-linked when it was link summoned, even if the player doesn't want to draw a card. Pretty neat. Here's a card that you may or may not be aware you can Ash, and that's Metaverse. Metaverse, when activated, has the ability to add a field spell from your deck to your hand or activate it to the field. And you don't choose until the card resolves. For this reason, you can Ash it. There are other cards that are similar, like Demise of the Land, that activate the card directly from the deck, but it only has that possible outcome. And because putting a card onto the field is not something you can negate with an Ash Blossom, you can never Ash Blossom Demise of the Land. Cards that put cards directly onto the field cannot be ashed. So cards that put cards directly onto the field would include something like Galatea, the Orcust Automaton, which sets an Orcust card. The effect of Union Hanger to add a card from deck to hand can be ashed, but you can't ash the effect to equip a monster, because that's not special summoning a monster. It's not adding a card from your deck to your hand. It's not sending a card from the deck to the graveyard. So there are certain effects that you can ash and certain effects that you can't. Let me see, a couple other things. Shaddolls Wendy. If this card is flip summoned, it can special summon a monster from the deck. If you were to flip summon a Wendy, or it were sent to the graveyard by a card effect, both of its effects special summon from the deck. You can ash those effects. There is an exception for the flip effect, though. You can't ash the effect of Wendy if it were flipped face up by battle. And the reason for that is battle and flip effects occur during the damage step. And you can only activate certain cards during the damage step, one of which is not Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. You can activate Ghost Spell during the damage step, assuming the effect met the requirement. So let's say you destroy Wendy during the battle. You can't Ash it because Ash requires that during the damage step you can only activate cards that either negate activations, which Ash does not do, modify attack and defense, or are counter traps, which Ash is not. If you were to destroy a El Shaddolls construct as a result of battle, it would still activate during the damage step to add back a Shaddolls fusion maybe from your graveyard. That you can bell, and that's because specifically Ghost Spell allows you to negate activations. So you can negate activations during the damage step. A couple other cards that people might have thought you could Ash would be like Cherubini, Ebon Angel of the Burning Abyss. It sends a level 3 from deck to grave as cost. So when you activate Cherubini, Chainlink 1, Cherubini, you send a level 3 from the deck to the graveyard. It's already in the graveyard. You can't Ash them and make them put the card back. The card was sent as cost. It's already there. Its effect is to increase the attack of a monster. That's not a valid effect to Ash. So you can't Ash a Cherubini. Cherubini might send a card like Graph, Millbranch of the Burning Abyss, which has an effect to summon from the deck. It will activate in a new chain, assuming it's not being blocked by some other card in the chain. You could Ash the Graph, but you can't Ash the Cherubini. Cherubini will always be able to send that level 3 if it could pay the cost. There are scenarios where you wouldn't pay the cost, like the graveyard can't be used, maybe from a dimensional shifter or something, but as long as they can pay the cost, you can't Ash them. Another card that pays cost would be Protoplant Verte Anaconda. It sends Red Eyes Fusion, usually. We'll talk about Red Eyes Fusion, to graveyard to copy the effect of that card. Now, you can't Ash the cost of Verte Anaconda. It sends the Red Eyes Fusion as cost. It's already in the graveyard when you pay your 2,000 life points and activate the effect of Verte Anaconda. Can't Ash that. It is changing its effect to the effect of Red Eyes Fusion. But by the time this effect resolves to copy the effect, its effect does not send a card from the deck to the graveyard. Its effect copies a fusion spell. And it copies a fusion spell that sends cards from decks to the graveyard. But because that effect is not determined before the card resolves, it's not a qualifying effect to use Ash on. So you can't Ash Verte because you can't negate cost. You also can't negate the effect that copies another card using an Ash Blossom. That's just not what the card can be used against. Another card that copies an effect would be something like Bamboozling Gossip Shadow. You can't negate the effect to change another effect into draw a card, because the effect of Bamboozling Gossip Shadow changes an effect of a monster into both players draw a card, but it changes an effect. It doesn't it doesn't have the effect to draw a card. It has the effect to make another effect into that effect, so it doesn't meet the qualifications. Hopefully you learned something from this video about what kinds of cards you can or can't ash. General rule of thumb, if the card has an effect that you choose when you activate it, and the effect does do one of the three things that you can ash it, like Triple Tactics Talents, if they choose the effect to draw. If the card has a possibility of resolving by moving cards from the deck to the graveyard, field, or hand, you can ash it if it has a possibility at resolution. Those pretty much meet the qualifications. So I hope you learned something from this video. Make sure to subscribe if you have not already. Like the video if you want to see more episodes like this in the future. Let me know what you want to see, and I'll try and make sure that a video similar to what you were looking for is released in the future.